I wonder, how would a modern day television news reporting team and a television news reporter explain and show us what was going on in Jerusalem on that first Palm Sunday? How would they show that reading that Joanne has just given to us? Jerusalem at that time, it was the Passover. It would be packed with people. The Passover was Israel's major religious festival of the year. And into that rode Jesus on a donkey. And the excited crowds were shouting, were proclaiming, as it said in verse 38, blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. Our television reporter might turn to the camera and point out that up until now, Jesus has tended to keep a low profile. He's avoided being prominent. But now he seems to be embracing the crowd. He seems to be up front, giving the lead. Actually, Jesus himself knew that this moment was significant. What he was actually doing was he was making the statement that at this moment, his kingdom is arriving. This is the moment that he's coming in. Before this incident, Jesus would have been surrounded by crowds, but surrounded, not up front. Now he's taken center stage. He's publicly leading from the front. He's riding in on the donkey, and the crowds are rejoicing, celebrating, because the crowds would have associated this moment with something they'd long been looking forward to. Hundreds of years before, Zechariah the prophet had predicted such a moment. He'd written this: "Rejoice, O people of Zion. Shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he's humble, riding on a donkey, riding on a donkey's colt." The crowd would have made that connection. The crowd would have seen Jesus coming in, would have known that verse, and would have thought, this could be it. This could be one of those moments in history that really changes the world. Hence their enthusiasm, hence their great greeting. But let's go back to our television reporter. And how would a television reporter do it? I suspect a good one will be a bit critical. Hang on a second. Anybody can fraudulently manipulate Zechariah's prophecy. I mean, after all you've got to do is borrow a donkey, and then you could ride in acting the part. Why should we believe this person just because he sent his disciples into a village nearby to get a donkey to ride in? Why should we believe just the fulfillment of that one prophecy? But what the reporter might not know is, of course, the fulfillment of prophecy by Jesus isn't a unique thing on this occasion. There are things that Jesus couldn't fabricate or fake very easily, such as the prophet Micah, 700 years before his birth, said that the promised Messiah must be born in Bethlehem. Jesus couldn't choose where he was born any more than the rest of us could. And of course, the promised Messiah had to be of the line of David, descended from David. Jesus was. He couldn't have faked that. And what the television reporter, of course, could not know is how the rest of the week would proceed, and just how many things that had been prophesied would actually take place during that week. Things like the exact sum of money predicted so long before for which he would be betrayed, or the fact that he would be crucified indicated that that would be the death before crucifixion was even invented as a way of execution. The fact that when Jesus hung on the cross, there was, as it was predicted, not a bone of his body would be broken. When the two thieves either side, the Romans broke their legs. Jesus couldn't control that. And of course, that the soldiers would cast lots for his clothing, all predicted. Now, this moment was significant. This moment was long predicted. This moment, the first Palm Sunday, was the time had come. The time for Jesus' kingdom was here. What we also see in this passage is actually that the nature of God is revealed. And I would hope our television reporter would pick up on that. In this passage, we see the very nature of God revealed. Because our television reporter, watching the events and giving an account of it, would be absolutely astonished by one detail. And that detail was this. As Jesus approached Jerusalem, riding on the donkey, with all the adoration of the crowd, it says that Jesus saw the city and he wept. Kings don't weep. Not in public, do they? It's a mark of weakness. Kings do not weep in public. It is very clear from the gospel accounts that Jesus was a king. It's throughout the Gospels. If we went back to Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, the angel appears to Mary to announce the birth of the child, her son Jesus. And how is the news broken? The child will be born, will sit on the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. He was to be a king. Follow the story on slightly. 2 years later, wise men came from the east following a star. What was their question? Where is the one who's going to be born? King of the Jews. Jesus was a king. In Matthew chapter 4, we get Jesus for the first time starts to make his proclamation, starts to teach. And one of the first proclamations he makes is, the kingdom of heaven is now at hand. It's his kingdom. And of course, if we look right to the end of Easter week, where Jesus hangs on a cross, one of those criminals executed beside him turns to him and says what? Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. There's no doubt that Jesus was a king. And yet as he rode into Jerusalem with the crowds waving their palm branches, laying their cloaks in front of him, waving and shouting Hosanna, he didn't sort of acknowledge with that royal wave and the gentle nod of the head to acknowledge the crowd and a permanently fixed smile. No, he wept. He wept. And the reason he wept was that he knew the hearts of the people. He knew that those people, the people of Jerusalem, had already in their hearts decided that they would reject him. He knew within his heart that by the end of the week, in 5 days, those shouts of adoration were going to turn to a demand for execution. He knew that as he brought his kingdom, they were going to reject it. And it broke his heart. And the reason that broke Jesus' heart is he also knew the consequences. He knew the outcome of the decision that they had in their minds already made that we would see through the Easter week. He knew what would happen. Listen again to what it says in verses 42 to 44 of our reading that Joanna brought to us. How I wish today that you, of all people, would understand the way of peace. But now it's too late, and peace is hidden from your eyes. Before long, your enemies will build ramparts against your walls and encircle you and close in on you from every side. They will crush you into the ground and your children with you. Your enemies will not leave a single stone in place because you did not recognize it when God visited you. The reason Jesus wept as he entered Jerusalem is that he knew the consequences of the decision that the crowd would make by the end of the week. Those calls, shouts of acclamation would become a cry for execution. He knew that they were rejecting his kingdom, and he knew the consequences, what the consequences of that would be. And of course, 37 and a half years later, that description is exactly what happened in AD 70. Having launched a rebellion, the Romans came back into the city of Jerusalem. They surrounded it, they captured it, they ransacked the city, they destroyed the temple. That prediction was fulfilled. Jesus' heart was broken because he knew the consequences of the decision that the people had made. What I hope our television reporter picking that up would point out is actually what we see in this passage is into the heart of God. We see how, in a way, the heart of God works. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 says something really significant. It simply says this: the Son, that's Jesus Christ, radiates God's own glory and expresses the very character of God. Now, that's what God is like. People often say, what is God like? What does God want me to do? We see in Jesus Christ what God is like. It grieves God. It breaks his heart when we reject him, when we reject his kingdom. It breaks his heart because he knows what the consequences will be. When we look at Jesus, we look at God. And that broken heart, it's rather like any of us as parents feel when our children do foolish things. When they get to that age where they're too old for you to direct them anymore, they have to make their own choices. But we know the consequences of the choice that they're making. We can't do anything about it. All we can do is watch. And it breaks the heart. That is the character of God. That's what we see on this Palm Sunday. And what we also see is God's purpose. God's purpose. And that's what I hope our television crew in Jerusalem would focus. As the procession arrives in Jerusalem, Jesus has left the village outside, he's made his way down the Mount of Olives, the crowd shouting, there's great expectation as the procession moves into the city and then closer to the centre of the city. I can imagine a television reporter reporting what's going on, reporting on the excitement of the crowd, and then asking the camera to pan around to show the scene. And I would imagine a television reporter would position themselves outside the temple, the fantastic temple in Jerusalem, the centre of worship. And they'd ask the camera to pan around, and as it did so, next to the temple, there's the Antonia fortress, basically the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, right by the temple. Itself, an enormous building, incredibly high walls, on top of which there would be the Roman soldiers guarding, looking out down on the city. In that fortress, there would be permanently 600 Roman soldiers on duty, maybe even more at Passover time. And there would probably be an expectation in the crowd that as Jesus, this king, was coming into Jerusalem, that's where he'd be heading. If the television reporter went out to the crowd, you know how they do, and they ask one or two people, what are you expecting? What are you looking for? They would probably say, Jesus is coming in, he's the promised Messiah. He's going to get rid of that lot. He's going to go there. We're hoping that he's going to use those wonderful powers. One of the reasons Jesus was so acclaimed was what he'd done before. Before he entered the city, he'd given sight to blind people. He'd raised his friend Lazarus from the dead just a couple of miles away. So the expectation would be huge. And the crowd would probably say, we hope he's going to use these fantastic powers to go up to that fort, to smash those gates into millions of pieces, to go in, to wipe out the occupying force and to set the nation free. And then the camera would show Jesus arriving. And he doesn't go into the fort. He goes into the temple. Goes into the temple. And there in the temple, our account says that he drives out those who are selling animals. The other gospel accounts give a more vivid picture that he actually turned over the tables of money changers and drove out those who were selling animals. Now, the law of Moses, which was followed at the time, required that people going to Jerusalem to worship, to celebrate, had to offer, well, certainly all males, to atone for their soul, had to offer, pay into the temple half a shekel. Each male going in there had to pay half a shekel. And it had to be paid in the temple currency. Not to worry if they didn't have temple currency, they were money changers. But it wasn't a free service. Like all currency conversions, there's a commission to be paid. That commission, some of it went into the temple coffers, and quite a large proportion went to the high priest and their family. And then the other thing that the law of Moses required was animal sacrifice. So the people would have to either bring or buy animals to offer as sacrifices. And at festival time, people had come from the whole nation. They couldn't bring these a long way, so they would have to buy them. And like any tourist destination, if you've got to buy stuff there, it's going to be expensive. And guess where a large proportion of the profits went? To the high priest and their families. So Jesus, having entered the city to announce his kingdom, having shown the character of God, he wipes them out. He drives out of the temple this. I would hope our television reporter would then turn to the camera and say, what is this showing us? What's it showing us? What Jesus was demonstrating is he was going to make it possible for those people to come to God. And what it really demonstrates is that, well, maybe what stops us coming to God isn't the speck in somebody else's eye, it's the plank in our own. The problem wasn't the Roman occupiers. The problem was the religious leaders who were keeping the people at bay. And what Jesus did in that act is he demonstrated his purpose. He was going to make it possible for people to come to God without hinder, without restriction. That was his key purpose. And at that point, I hope our television reporter will conclude the account of the day. Why? What is it all about? Well, coming into Jerusalem that day, Jesus has shown who he is. He's demonstrated how much he cares. He's made it absolutely clear that he's going to do something about it. And that really is the whole focus of Easter. I hope that's our focus this week. We'll remember it as we come around the table shortly. Jesus on Palm Sunday made it clear who he was, made it clear that he cares. He wants it to be possible for us to come to God. He knows the consequences if we don't. He knows the consequences when we reject him. And he's made it possible. He came to do something about it.